This is my overview of the Cherries Jubilee. The whole tutorial is found in my private online school, Viv Studio. Now I've got my reference photo. I didn't like the background. I'm just going through my thought process. I wanted those cherries to pop, and I really wanted those highlights to show. So what I did was I went ahead and masked off all the highlights, and I decided that the background needed to be more of a bluish gray. That blue will really contrast with the orange in the cherries, and it will give those cherries a nice pop when they're put next to each other. Much better than the original background of the reference photo. So then I just used my paint. I mixed up plenty so that I wouldn't have to worry about it running out before I got my background finished, and just painted it straight onto dry paper. Now once my background was finished, I let that dry, and I wanted to go ahead and use the same background color and add some shadows around the bowl. And I'm going to show you quickly how I did that, just using that same background color. First, I just painted on the color right onto dry paper, just like we did the background. I started underneath the lip of the bowl, and I just went right on. And the good thing is you've got the masking fluid on the stems and on all of the highlights, so you can just paint right over that masking fluid and it will protect your paper. Once you get a good amount of paint down, just rinse out your brush, use clear water, and begin to blend it down toward the bottom of the bowl and underneath the cherries. And you want to do this all around the bowl, getting in those shadows. Now this is just the first layer. We're going to come back and add more layers to deepen these shadows at the end, and also we're going to add another layer to the background. Or I did add another layer. I'm not sure if I'm going to show you that. You might not need to see it, but I did add another bluer layer to the background before we finished it. Now once you get your shadows in, you're going to go ahead and with a nice bright yellow, you want to paint an undercoat on all of your cherries. Now this bright yellow will really make those cherries glow on the finished product. It'll give it a jewel-like quality. You'll really see how it makes those cherries pop. So you'll just go ahead. I'm using some yellows, a little bit of red and yellow mixed to make orange. Those are going in my darker areas on the cherries, and I'm also putting in some of the lightest shadows and where I want my shadows to be. So this is just the initial layer. We're going to do the layers were done in the cherries were done in 3 different layers. And this is just the first one. You'll want to paint all of the cherries with this nice, once you've painted all the cherries yellow, gotten that yellow base on them and letting them dry, then you'll be ready to start for your next layer. And in the next layer, we're going to add a lot more of the really bright reds, a few darker reds, and a little bit of oranges. So once this gets dry and you've painted all of the cherries with that first undercoat of the bright yellow, then you'll do the next layer. Now here I'm using a little bit of wet on wet technique. I wetted the cherry surface first, right where I wanted the shadow to be, and just dropped in that really bright red. And what I'm doing is I'm just looking for the shapes of the shadows and putting those in. Once I get those mapped out, we will let this dry once I put those down, and I'm going to use a combination of the really bright red, some of the yellow and red mixed to make the orange, and a little bit of a red-orange mixture. Remember where you want it to be the darkest. Always look at your reference photo. Be looking at your reference photo more than you're actually looking at your painting. That way you can see where the shapes of the shadows are, put them in the right place, make sure they're the right value and tone. Now I'm just blending it out with some clear water on that edge and pulling it out into the next shape, adding a little bit of the orange mixture there, and that just warms it up. And we're just going to continue around the cherry until we get that second layer built up, just using our reds and our oranges. Actually, we're using red and yellow to make orange, and we also have a reddish orange color that we're using. So it's two separate orange colors that we're using. And we're putting that right over that bright yellow base. And as you can see, it is really popping. It is making that red so warm and so juicy looking already. And I'm adding a little bit of dark red right in the darkest areas of the shadows. Now this is the second layer to the cherries. There'll be one more layer that cleans all of this up and it'll look really beautiful. So just continue to lay in the colors, blend it with a damp brush with clean water on it as you work, and build up those layers to get that, make a more realistic cherry. In the center here, I'm adding a darker shadow because of course it's darker right here in the center where the stem pops out. I'm looking at my reference and just noticing where those dark shadows are and putting those in. And then smoothing everything out with just clear water. Once let that one's dry, you move on to all of the rest of your cherries and do the same thing. In some areas, you're going to use the wet and wet technique. Other areas, you're going to put wet on dry, remembering to watch where the yellow parts of the cherries are. You want to leave some of your cherries with the yellow tone shining through. Just refer to your reference photo to see where those yellows are, and then make sure that you do this second layer on every cherry, paying attention to where the shadows are, putting the darker areas in the shadows, the darker red in the shadows that are the darkest, especially toward the middle of the bowl where the cherries are overlapping each other and really casting dark shadows on each other. And those cherries that are at the bottom underneath, they're going to be your darkest cherries. So we're going to use a really dark red to get that shadowy cherries color on those cherries. Since they're underneath all the cherries, they're going to be a much darker red. So I'm just going to take that and paint that over these cherries that are underneath the other cherries. And that dark cherry color makes that lighter, paler red-orange really pop. And eventually we're going to take off the masking fluid and work on those highlights. And the highlights really make this come to life once you get those right. But you just work on your shadows, the shadow placement, remembering that these cherries underneath are going to be darker than the ones on top, where your light source is coming from. And anytime you have too much pigment, just take a damp, dry brush and lift some of that pigment out. And that'll help you form some of the highlights as well. You might even want to add, here I'm just adding a little bit of blue to darken up the darkest shadows underneath. Doing that wet into wet in just really small areas, and then just taking the tip of my brush and kind of blending it in. And you'll just keep working your way around to all the cherries that are underneath all the upper cherries until you get a nice second coat on of the reds, the dark reds, the oranges. Then you're going to let it dry, remove the masking fluid, and then we're going to start on adding the final details to the cherries once all of that has dried. And here I'm just putting in the shadows, again working right onto the dry paper. I'm also making some of the highlights where I removed the masking fluid a little bit smaller. I did make them a little too large with the masking fluid. I'm taking a wet, damp brush and just smoothing out the colors around those highlights so that the highlights look velvety and blurry and they're not so crisp, and it looks more realistic and makes the surface of the cherry look smooth and shiny. I'm still adding some more red oranges as well. And I'm really just, again, getting in the shadow work, blending it as I go, keeping the surface or keeping each section wet until I add the next section. Paying attention to where the deep shadows are and adding the really deep red to where the deep shadows are. Leaving the yellow where it needs to be visible. And then smoothing the edges with just a damp brush so that we don't have any harsh edges on the cherries. And I'm working pretty fast because I don't want my edges to dry. I want to be able to smooth them out with the tip of my brush so that this is the last layer of the cherries and everything is smoothed out and they become more realistic. And so I am being really careful to work quickly and to keep all of my edges as wet as possible so that I don't get the hard edges. Now I'm painting around my highlights too. I'm picking up pigment with a damp brush where I want the cherry to be lighter. I'm blending out edges with damp brush with just clean water and letting that yellow really shine through and working my way around the highlight. I've also put a small bit of color on the highlight because I don't want it to be solid white. It has a little bit of a pink tinge to it since it is part of the cherry. I'm adding a little bit of the darker colors where it's really dark. And it's already looking much, much more realistic. And I'm just taking a damp brush and kind of smoothing out and softening those hard edges. Now once you get that done, you want to do that to each cherry. Now this one, I just went ahead and scrubbed around the edges with a scrub brush. Dabbed up that excess pigment with paper towel to smooth out that highlight because the highlight was so large and I didn't like that hard edge. Then I just added some of the yellow orange, the red orange, the darker red where the shadows were darker, and I worked fast and tried to keep the edges wet and blended so that I wouldn't have those hard lines and those hard edges. And that's the key, is just to work fast and keep your edges damp so that you can continue to smooth it out and blend it with the tip of your brush. If you have too much pigment, just take a stiff bristle brush, just like I'm doing here, and scrub the area and then pick up the excess pigment that you just scrubbed up with a paper towel or a tissue. Now I'm adding a little bit more shadow detail with my fine brush, my small round brush, so that we can get that more realistic look, get the shadows in. And then I'm going to work on all of the stems, and I'm just using green, yellow, and red to create the nice greens and browns and olive tones that are in the stems. And I'm paying attention to where there are more shadows and light and putting a little texture on with just tiny little marks on my stems. Now to clean it all up, I've pretty much finished it, and I'm just trying to deepen up these last shadows here. They're still a little bit too pale for me, so I'm just adding a little bit more color to them. To the background, I didn't show it, but the background I added a nice blue-green over the gray, and that really helped bring forward those cherries. And I'm doing the same thing, darkening up the edges of the bowl, adding a little bit of red while it's still wet just to look like a reflection, and blending it out with a damp brush. And it's pretty much finished. Just going to add a few more details. I'm just fussing with it now. I really can stop at this point, but I'm a fussy painter, so I'm still fussing with it. And that is one thing that I'm still working on, is to control how much fussiness I do on my paintings. And just blending out some of these darker cherries under here that are more in the distance, just to blend them out. So there you have it, a beautiful lush bowl of cherries. Now if you're interested in joining my online school, it's Viv Studio, just visit my website, www.artwithviv.com. This tutorial is in the website, the whole tutorial, and it comes with supply list, reference photo, and an outline drawing in case you're not confident of your drawing skills. So I hope to see you there. Again, it's www.artwithviv.com. I hope you enjoyed my tutorial and happy painting, guys.